If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine, and maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them, from disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today I am delighted to bring to you all Counsellor on Religious Trauma, Janice Selbie. But before we hear from Janice in all of her wisdom and professionalism, I wanted to announce some great news. I have been invited to join the CrimeCon team for the first ever CrimeCon in Scotland, Glasgow on September the 10th. This event is already set to be huge, with some leading true crime experts making appearances, speaking at panels and running interactive sessions for guests. This is on top of the June 11th and 12th CrimeCon weekend down in London. I have recently sat down with other podcast hosts attending the event and had a chance to see the schedule and the layout. It's going to be an incredible weekend, and the live interview room where I will be conducting my first ever live conversation looks awesome. You can use the code CULT at crimecon.co.uk to get a 10% discount on tickets today at both the London and Glasgow events. And there are even some 15 and 30% off codes for patrons and top fans of this podcast. You can get in touch with me personally to access these special codes, where there are also some limited discounts on hotel rooms too. For today's chat, you can see the video recording of my conversation with Janice on patreon.com/thecultvault and subscribe to the Patreon for as little as £1 a month, with lots of other exclusive content, ad-free weekly episodes, free memoirs, and so much more. In this episode, I sat down with former Christian fundamentalist and current counsellor on religious trauma, Janice Selbie. During our conversation, Janice explores various earmarks of religious trauma and how people may recognise spiritual abuse. On April the 29th through to May the 1st, Janice is hosting a conference on religious trauma, and listeners of this show can get 20% off tickets to this conference today by using the code podcast20. On October the 14th to the 16th, Janice is also hosting a conference named Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. And if you book onto both conferences today, you can get a $50 discount. You can find Janice at divorcing-religion.com, where you can use podcast20 as a code to get 20% off, or follow the links in the episode description. But for now, here is Janice. So hello, Janice, and thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I am looking forward to chatting to you at length about your current profession and the ways in which you help others overcome their religious trauma. And hopefully we can translate some of these methods to our listeners today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to everybody?
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. Yes, my name is Janice Selbie, and I live in Canada. I'm a registered professional counselor, and I'm also a religious recovery consultant. So I work with people who are recovering from religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome.
And I'm not sure if that is a Canadian accent that you have, but are you kind of born and bred Canadian, or did you move over there later on in life?
I am. I was born here, although I did spend a portion of my childhood in New York.
Okay, interesting. And being a religious recovery consultant, I feel like that's a very niche and specific profession for somebody to be in. So do you have sort of like a history or background with religion?
Yes. I was raised in an evangelical Christian family. So my parents believed that the Bible was true and literal, and church was a very big part of my upbringing. And my father also was a narcissist. So when you combine that with fundamentalist religious beliefs, what it did for me was it made me very comfortable with rules. I was always seeking out black and white rules, rigid thinking. That's the only thing that made me feel safe. Because if I knew my father's rules, I could be safe. I could avoid his punishment or his wrath. So then I became very devout in my Christian faith, married a man who wanted to become a pastor, and then homeschooled our children. I homeschooled them for a time. So I was very invested in Christianity. It was my entire identity as well as my ideology. And then a series of tragedies happened, family tragedies and calamities in a very short span of time when I was in my late 30s. And that was just it. That was it. It broke my faith. I couldn't see how there could be an omniscient, loving God who would allow such terrible tragedies to take place. And certainly I thought that I was living very devoutly, living a holy life, being merciful and compassionate to people. And so, the problem of suffering is really what shook me free from my cognitive dissonance. So prior to that, I'd been able to make all kinds of excuses about why my religion was the one true religion. And then one day I just couldn't make those excuses anymore. So then my marriage was also unraveling at the same time that my faith was rapidly dissolving. And I eventually divorced my husband, divorced religion, went back to school to become a counselor, and then was still very much focused on figuring out what had happened to me. I didn't even know the words to type into the computer to look it up. And I was so devastated, but you still have to keep going to work. You know, you're grieving this massive loss. You've lost your entire identity, but you have to keep going to work every day because people just think you've stopped believing in Santa Claus. And it's so much more pervasive and so much deeper than that. And eventually I started learning about religious trauma. First, I started studying a lot about cults because I was recognizing some of the things I seemed to have in common with people who were recovering from cult indoctrination. And then I found Dr. Marlene Winnell online, and her book is called Leaving the Fold. And I hope that anyone who's recovering from religion will read Leaving the Fold. It's a very helpful book.
Wow, that's a very chronological summary of your journey to kind of where you are now. Mm-hmm. And there's so many things in there that I feel are prevalent to discuss. And I know that we're going to focus more on how you can help others with their recovery, or what resources are available for people that are suffering from religious trauma syndrome from your experience. But there are a few things I'd like to ask you about your experience, if that's okay.
Sure.
So do you feel like growing up with a narcissistic father may have paved the way for you to experience cult-like control within the home as well as within the church setting?
I think so. He was the only one in the family who was permitted to express anger. The rest of us had to constantly stuff our anger. We could be happy, we could be sad if we weren't too sad. So he would rage, you know, he would sometimes punch holes in walls and things that just don't make children feel very safe. So I didn't want to cross him. I had a tremendous fear of disappointing or upsetting him. And my mom was just the opposite. So one thing we recognize now is that narcissists tend to seek out codependent people, and codependent people, boy, they're just drawn right in by those narcissists. So my mom was my example of a loving Christian wife. And so that meant never having a say, constantly stuffing those feelings, bending over backwards to try and satisfy and placate the husband, giving him full authority and control in the home. And then, of course, attending church, that was an echo chamber. Those things were repeated back to me. Your husband he's your spiritual head. He's the head of the family. He's to be the one tasked with making decisions. And so it all kind of fed into each other. And also, if we are introduced to religion in our family of origin, it's filtered through our caregivers' personalities, our parents' personalities. So it came through my dad. So I saw God then as quite, I better toe the line or else there'd be a problem. And through my mom was very much about the love and mercy and compassion aspect. So I did see those as being traits of the God that I believed in as well. But I think altogether it was fairly unhealthy. Certainly the more fundamentalist I became.
Do you feel like maybe your mum being sort of the perfect Christian wife in the fundamentalist sense or evangelical sense maybe showed you what a positive female role model looked like in your church?
Yes, which would be to say, hail the patriarchy. It's really, that's, and yet I saw her have a job. My dad was prone to quitting jobs on every whim if he thought the boss disrespected him in some way. And there were 4 children in the family, so mom had to be prepared to go out and get work. And she really liked being in the working world, but she realized she had to be very careful about it and keep real boundaries there, or my father could insist that she quit her interactions.
Something you mentioned about homeschooling your children as well. Mm-hmm. It's funny because I'm interviewing Heather Grace Heath tomorrow, author of the memoir Lovingly Abused, about her experiences growing up in Bill Gothard's IBLP. So she has written a lot about the effects that homeschooling can have on some children, and how there needs to be some type of reform in America around the policies of homeschooling. I wondered if you kind of could shed your perspective on what homeschooling was like for you, and perhaps what you think now, where you are today, what could change to improve the lives of those really sheltered children that have access to no curriculum whatsoever.
Right. My take on homeschooling was a little bit somewhat different than the Gothard crew, in the sense that I felt education was extremely important. So I knew a lot of Christians who their children, in my opinion, were not being adequately educated. And I instead chose to follow the trivium method, which is kind of a classical education. So I wanted them to have a very good grasp of history and just all sorts of things like that. But I also was being driven by fear. I was highly motivated to keep them away from any secular or worldly or sinful influences. And I think also there was a very high demand put on my oldest daughter in particular to perform. And this is partly because she's firstborn, and the firstborn's a prototype in every family, and they get lots and lots of pressure. But I didn't realize how much pressure I was applying to her, putting on her to try and be perfect and fit into a mold of perfection.
Have you had lots of discussions about that situation since then with your daughter?
Oh, yes. I've apologized verbally and in writing to my children within the last, maybe say 5 or 10 years. The more I started uncovering my own trauma and recognizing, being on the other side and looking back and seeing, oh, I can't believe I did this. And I felt it was very important that my daughters know why I was sorry, what I did wrong, and how sorry I was. And neither my ex-husband, their father, or my children, none of us are religious now. And we're actually a fairly close family. We have family chat on Facebook, and we're interacting in there throughout the day, even though, so we're divorced now, and I have a new partner. But yeah, it's just, it's worked out very beautifully, very well.
And your ex-partner is no longer religious as well. This is the
Correct.
person who was striving to become a pastor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's really interesting. I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to speak to his experiences at all and give us sort of a brief summary on how that came to be.
He just made his own way out. It was different for him because I was second gen. I was raised in it from the time I was born. He was first generation. He didn't really embrace evangelicalism until he was 18 or 19 years old. He was raised in a nominally Catholic household, but it wasn't until he was in his late teens that he really gravitated to evangelicalism. So his temperament and personality and views had already had the opportunity to develop. But it's not that way when you're born into it. When you're second gen, it's all your values and your views are being filtered and fed to you through your parents' religion. So it was a real gong show when I left. I liken it to a beach ball being held underwater for too long, and then you take your hands off and the ball comes up and there's water everywhere. It's messy. Because it was my entire identity. And so it was really disconcerting, disorienting for me. It wasn't that way for him. He already knew who he was. Apart from religion. So when I left, it was a much bigger mess and very emotional and difficult. And also I am a more emotional person. He's, I would say, on the spectrum. So he keeps those emotions under pretty tight wraps. And so his experience was just different than mine.
I imagine, and this may be a conclusion that I'm jumping to, that when you found your former partner and introduced him to your parents and they knew kind of his religious background and his aims to become a pastor, that your parents were probably very happy with that decision and that direction that you seemed to be taking in your life at that time.
I think my father was happier than my mother. I think on some level, she wished that I would wait longer and experience more of the world. She's much more common sense and grounded, even though she is religious. She's much more common sense and grounded than my father, much more progressive than my father. But yeah, I only ever felt supported by them. And I think my mom could also see that temperamentally and personality-wise, my ex-husband and I were very, very different. And I think she saw that it could lead to some issues. It's kind of hard when you're opposites, but they do attract.
And I asked you about your kind of thoughts on homeschooling then and now. And I realized as I asked that question that you may still have moments in your life where you are introduced to something secular that you weren't familiar with growing up. So you may have those same experiences that the homeschool generation of sort of the ATI and IBLP groups may experience with bands and film references and things. Do you feel like that's an experience that you have? Yes,
I absolutely have gaps in my social and cultural understanding of things. So I'd say for sure from about 1993 to 2000, anyway, at least, it's just this huge gap where I wasn't seeing movies or really watching a lot of TV, listening to secular radio. Everything was only very, very Christian during that time. Although when I grew up, we had a TV in our home and I was allowed to watch it within parameters. There were certain shows I couldn't watch, but I was much more strict with my children. We didn't even have TV for a number of years. So yeah, I can relate to that. And I do, I'll just give a quick mention for the conference on religious trauma that's coming up online at the end of April. We are having a homeschool and religious school panel. And Ryan Stoller is one of our guests there. And he's very much involved in the United States in trying to reform homeschooling. He really believes there needs to be much more oversight, government oversight, because children are not receiving adequate education. So he might be an interesting person for you to reach out to.
Absolutely. And thank you for the name. I've just made a note of it here in my notebook. But of course, all of that stuff around perhaps being stricter with your own children than your parents were with you, that all sort of came to a head in your 30s, where you have this snap after a series of traumatic events. Then you start researching cults and trying to understand what had been happening to you your entire life, which is such a complex thing to comprehend, because it's even a year or two, or even 6 months, when people come on the show and say that they were introduced to a group but were only kind of a part of it for a couple of months, even just those experiences stay with that person for years afterwards. So to take your whole life up to that point and try to kind of unravel it, turn it in every direction, and try to pull it apart and rebuild yourself, and then not even reintegrate, but integrate yourself into society post-religion, or at least post-evangelicalism. You then come across this person who writes specific to religious trauma, and that's kind of where you found yourself moving more towards the niche profession that you're in today.
That's exactly right. I found Dr. Winnell. I saw a video of her on the internet discussing religious trauma, and then everything came together, and I realized, yes, it is. I've been traumatized. That's what's happened. So I ran out and got her book, which is called Leaving the Fold. And then I connected with her. I phoned her, and I flew out to San Francisco a couple of times when she was hosting retreats there for other people recovering from fundamentalist groups. And that was the first time I had ever had the opportunity to interact face to face with people who had been just as devout as me, people who loved Jesus just as much as me, former missionaries, former pastors, and from all different backgrounds. There are ex-Mormons, ex-JWs, ex-evangelicals, ex-Muslims, and all of us somehow ended up in this space of no longer believing what we'd been taught. And that was very healing, to be able to connect in that way. And that prompted me then to write out, to develop my own curriculum, a workshop, an online workshop called the Divorcing Religion Workshop. And that was a lot of from my own research that I'd been doing prior to discovering that, oh, this is what it is. It's religious trauma. So I developed the Divorcing Religion Workshop and developed a closer working relationship with Dr. Winnell. And then the rest is history.
And for anybody who's not familiar with the subject, we've spoken about it a little bit previously on the show, specifically when I had Jeffrey Wallace as a guest, author of A Voice from Inside, Notes on Religious Trauma in a Captive Organization. He's a physically and mentally out Jehovah's Witness who was sort of my introduction to exactly what is religious trauma syndrome, what does spiritual abuse look like, how do we define it, how can we recognize the signs. But this is, although he backs it up with a lot of expert text and references a lot of experts in the field, I feel like your perspective on religious trauma as a whole, as opposed to directing it towards Jeffrey's personal experiences in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and why things like the shunning processes and those practices in certain high demand religious groups really need to change to stop people from having thoughts of suicidal ideation and extreme depression, and all of those things that I discussed with Jeffrey on that episode. Could you tell us what is religious trauma syndrome?
Sure. Dr. Winnell is actually the one who coined that phrase, religious trauma syndrome. And she uses it to describe a collection of symptoms which are common among those of us who have spent time in high demand religious groups. So there are losses that we suffer as a result of belonging to that group. And then when we leave, there are more losses that we suffer. It's a real kind of double whammy. You're just hit from both sides. And I mean, the symptoms can be physical and emotional, psychological, mental. So because we are talking about grief, we are grieving a huge set of losses when we walk away from our religious faith that has been our comfort and our guidepost and our community. So there are lots of losses that have to be mourned. And then there are things like we can feel anger, confusion, the sadness. We can find it very hard to move forward, kind of an inertia sets in. There's such fear and guilt and shame often involved from having grown up in those situations. And then we can also have some physical manifestations of that grief. You know, we could be having GI upset, gastrointestinal issues, tension, headaches, just all the sorts of things that you might think about if someone is grieving. What are they having to cope with? Poor sleep. They're sleeping too much. They're not sleeping enough. They stop eating. They're overeating. They're self-medicating. All these things can be part of religious trauma syndrome.
So when you talk about sort of the losses in a high demand religious group that someone might experience, some of the things we've mentioned on the show that could be relevant are things like individualism or access to those secular activities, leisure time and hobbies, and things that you'd like to enjoy outside of religious groups and commitments, friendships and relationships, and access to sometimes healthcare, sex and relationship education. Are these sort of some of the things that you would be referencing when you say losses that people experience within the group?
Absolutely. And another big one is time. And you can never get that time back. I work with many people who also have they've lost a lot of money. So we can even just call that all resources. So they were raised in it, and then they spent $50,000, $100,000 attending a Bible college or a religious-based institution to become a pastor or a theologian or whatever. Now they don't believe anymore, and that's decades of their life. And then, of course, if they married because of religion, so religious people tend to marry young because they think it's a sin to have sex outside of marriage. They will often marry someone who, outside of religion, this was my case, outside of religion, my former husband and I really had very little in common. It was strictly the religion that bound us together. So when I started pulling on that thread and the whole sweater unraveled, it made it really hard and very unappealing to try and stay together. Of course, it was much more complicated than just that.
Of
but
course.
Those are some of the issues that I hear from clients for sure.
With the modesty and the purity culture that comes with a lot of high demand religious groups as well, there's no chance for you to, first of all, understand your own individualism and things that you enjoy, things that you like, things that you'd like to pursue in terms of like maybe musical instruments or which career path you're thinking about going down. Of course, then there's also no chance for you to really get to know your partner on sort of just like a casual level where you see if you have things in common. Maybe you wouldn't even know where to start on identifying what those things are that you have in common outside of religion, as you said. So I often think of it as kind of not being able to try on your wedding dress until your wedding day. And then once you've put that dress on, you have to keep it on for the rest of your life. It might be itchy, it might be scratchy.
That's a great picture.
There's no, like, you might not like the way that it fits. You might not like the color of the dress, you know, and so it's hard to imagine finding somebody so early on in life where maybe you don't even really know yourself, or you haven't had the chance to know yourself, to then make that massive commitment and choice on which person you're going to continue the rest of your life with, within religion or without, because of course the practices around sort of divorce and something else that I thought was really interesting about Heather's book, Lovingly Abused, was how she really explained the umbrella analogy for
that
me.
Awful umbrella.
Which I was going to ask you about in the first part, because you said that, you know, your father, you know, he was the head of the family, and then you found a partner who was striving to be a pastor. And when you were saying that your father struggled to hold down a job, or he were kind of bounced from job to job, and your mum kind of was able to find jobs and really hold on to them and really progress in those jobs. I was thinking back to Heather's work and how the woman in the family might be blamed for the husband not being able to hold down the job because she's kind of straying from underneath the umbrella. So I didn't know if you could just quickly summarize the umbrella analogy for anybody that's not heard of it before.
Right. So the idea being that the umbrella is our protector. And so at the top we have God, and God is protecting dad, and dad's protecting mom, and mom's protecting the children. But that if you stray outside of the bounds of that umbrella, if you walk outside there, so we would just picture if you walk outside the umbrella, you're going to get wet. But in those fundamentalist Christian terms, when you walk out from underneath the umbrella, you're absolutely on your own. The devil's going to get you. You'll get pregnant, you'll get attacked, you'll get kidnapped, whatever. Anything very fear-based is the belief system. So it's the opposite of autonomy. It's curiosity is stamped out, it's gotten rid of, and it's replaced by obedience at all costs. That's what a child must be. So we can't praise a child for their individualism, because individualism doesn't work well with obedience. Instead, we have to shave off those corners so we can really push them into that round hole. And it's painful. It's not good for children, and it's a terrible strain and stress for mom to live in that situation a lot of times. And you know what, with my ex-husband, it was straining and stressful for him to have to be constantly in a position of authority and leadership, because he is actually a very chill person. He's quite a laid back type of person. And he didn't frankly want to have to be the one always calling the shots. And part of the reason I did such a deep dive into fundamentalism and wearing a head covering, say, for example, I grew my hair very long and always wore it up and covered. And that was, for me, I chose that to serve as a physical reminder that I was to be submissive, because submission is not something that comes naturally for me. And so any of the issues we had in our marriage, I believed could not be his fault, because God gave him to me to be my spiritual head. So any problems in the marriage must be my fault. And it's probably because I'm not being submissive enough. And so I saw that as a sacrifice of true devotion to my God and to my husband. My husband permitted me to, I asked him for his permission if I could start wearing a head covering, and he agreed to it. But within a few years, when he was pastoring, he asked me to remove it. He said it's creating too much of a barrier between the other congregants, because none of them are doing it. And I was so hurt and offended when he asked me to take it off. But interestingly, that same year was when I started to just expand and explore, let myself think a little bit. Maybe it's not all my fault. And that year, my parents separated also.
So kind of getting into that space of a kind of the family tragedies building up and getting you to that point where you're kind of ready to take off the religious glasses.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I didn't know anyone better than my mother. She is a saintly person, just very loving. When I was growing up, she would never lock the door to our home because she said if any child or teenager in the neighborhood was in trouble, they had to know there was a safe place they could come and sleep on the sofa. Yes, she's a very loving person. She did not deserve the abuse that she received from my dad. But so I thought, okay, look, if my mom can actually show my dad the door, like say to him, okay, I've had enough. Maybe I do not have to be stuck in this harsh, difficult environment for the rest of my life. And that was it was subconscious. Like I wasn't even processing those thoughts, but it's like a seed was planted. And divorce was many years off for me. It was still 10 years down the road, probably after that.
And do you think that the time and the money that a lot of people put into their time or tenure within the religious groups that they're affiliated with might add to things like sunk cost fallacy, which actually keeps people in the movement for longer, even if maybe they are doubting or no longer believe whatsoever?
Absolutely. Sunk cost fallacy is huge for anyone who is in a high demand group. And so lately I've been seeing different shows on Netflix. I don't know if you guys have Netflix over there, but lots of shows about fraud and fraudulent behavior and people getting sucked in by narcissistic manipulators, and they can even be sucked in for years. And then even once they start thinking something doesn't feel right, it's very hard for them because they realize they have wasted so much time, so many opportunities. They've burned so many bridges with relationships. They really have to get to a very uncomfortable point before they're willing to cut ties and end that relationship. And that's not just about religion. I mean, fundamentalism can be found in politics. It can be found in nutrition. It can be found in ecological groups because humans are prone to extremes. So what we really need to do is make sure that we're not just in an echo chamber surrounded by our own views. It's good for us to be bumping up against people who have different views, and we must be willing to hold things loosely. I ask people, are you holding your beliefs or are they holding you? That's a really important distinction to make.
It's interesting what you said there about the Netflix shows, because I've been thinking this a lot lately myself. People will watch things like Tinder Swindler and will be really shocked by the way in which these people are taken advantage of. Yeah. But a lot of the tactics of manipulation and narcissism and coercion are exactly the same as those that we will see repeated, and the earmarks of cults and high demand groups that you and I will kind of see day in, day out with the various people we speak to, that the cult experts talk about. But people outside of these experiences who consume this content at such a high rate, more for the shock factor than for the educational side of things, will be like, oh my goodness, how could somebody be reeled in by this? And you know, shows like Catfish on MTV, people love Catfish because they're like, is it the person they've been talking to? Isn't it? How could you have a relationship with somebody for 5 years and never meet them face to face? But of course, those questions aren't so black and white. There's so much more to it in terms of psychological and emotional attachments and methodologies that are used systematically against people to actually create these scenarios. So I kind of appreciate that these things are being highlighted in the media, and that people are interested in learning about them. But I wish that there would be a bit more around how these situations are able to happen, and allow the victims of these situations to be painted in a fairer light, because of course what we try to do on the podcast quite a lot is break that stigma of the types of people that might join a high demand group, especially people like yourself, second generation, third, fourth, who are born into those movements and don't have a say in how they grow up.
We're all, every single human at some point in their life is vulnerable to these manipulation tactics. And so for people like me who grew up second gen in dysfunctional, codependent family dynamics, we are extremely vulnerable to narcissistic manipulation. So I actually really encourage my female clients to watch some of these shows. And then also, of course, just the fact that if you're an honest person, you do actually expect other people to be behaving in an honest manner. I present myself as I am. I expect other people to do the same. And then, of course, women being raised in the patriarchy, we are taught not to question. It's rude to question someone. And then as soon as a man starts to raise his voice or say, how dare you, we're taught to back down right away. We have to be the peacekeepers. All of these things, it's just a toxic stew. So anybody is at some point vulnerable. And also, those going through a transition point in life. So someone, maybe a young person, has moved away to university for the first time. They're in a new town. Cults love university towns for that very reason. Or maybe you've lost your partner, you've lost your job, you've lost a child. People who are imprisoned and incarcerated, religious groups love, and cults love to get inside there. And really, gangs inside the walls of prisons operate like cults, high demand groups. And so people are vulnerable. If we need belonging and purpose and significance, these are this like a vacuum, and the cults and the gangs and the religious groups, they'll rush in to meet these needs. So we really need to ensure that we're aware of those needs as humans, and we're meeting them to the best of our ability, so that we are less vulnerable to these high demand groups.
There's something interesting about what you said there about transitions and how people may be more vulnerable during those periods. It was actually during a number of transitional periods with you that you were able to have the opposite experience, where you actually started to pull back from your religious beliefs, which I just thought was an interesting thing to kind of think about.
It can be a incredibly powerful threshold when we're on the threshold of transition. We can go one way or we can go the other way. So people who are coming from a fundamentalist background may tend to really dig in their heels, with that sunk cost fallacy that you referenced a little bit ago. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to be willing to explore your beliefs, what you really, really believe, especially if you've been told that you will go to hell. You'll suffer eternal torment and separation from your loved ones for your disbelief. I mean, talk about a built-in way just to keep you on that hamster wheel, never getting off. It's that fear of hell.
And some of the fears that people may have when trying to make that decision on whether to stay or whether to leave, whether it's going to be an immediate decision or whether it's going to take a number of years, like your kind of said before, your divorce was still 10 years down the line from this moment. Are the losses outside of the group that you mentioned before as well, which could look like loss of community, that safety that you said you had with your father and his kind of strict set of rules, and you knew exactly what to expect from him. He knew exactly what to expect from you as a child. And so you kind of had those boundaries and felt safe and secure within that. So you have this kind of safety net torn off, the community aspect of church life and church commitments, sermons and get-togethers and church-related activities. Sometimes I often mention that there are insular communities in a lot of Jewish communities and a lot of Mormon communities where they will use Mormon-based companies to come and carry out car repairs, roof repairs.
That's right.
So if you have one of these businesses, you then have that to consider. Is it going to affect your financial status, your livelihood, your
or if you were a pastor? That's
of course.
If you leave that, and really the huge one also is that loss of identity. That is it can be such an existential crisis that we are plunged into, and then we suddenly feel like we don't have supports. Before, when we were having doubts, we would go to the pastor, we would go to the Bible, go to the Christian counselor, but now we can't go to those people. They're going to be speaking against us in the terms of they're going to be trying to get us to turn back to the Bible. They're going to say you need to pray more, you just need to have more faith. So it's a time when people are extremely vulnerable, when they're disillusioned and dissatisfied. That's another prime time when cults can come in and pick up the pieces for that person and reassemble them the way that they want them to be.
I guess that's kind of where the phenomenon of cult hopping would really take place as well.
Exactly. And that's something that I talk about in my Divorcing Religion workshop. The very last module is called Don't Let an Old Flame Burn You Twice. And it's about how we can avoid falling victim to fundamentalist thinking and fundamentalist groups as we move forward in our lives.
If it's all that you've ever known and you do have safety in that environment, then as you said before, with people who might find some solace in relationships with narcissists, where they may actually put themselves in some kind of danger, whether it's emotionally or physically, because they've grown up with a very regimented and strict set of rules, you may just find comfort in that familiarity of falling in with somebody that may present in that way.
And feeling like a martyr. Christianity is all about martyrdom. And so I certainly saw my mother behave that way. And actually, one of the people who really helped clarify things when I was considering divorce was my big brother. And I have older siblings, and they are not religious at all. And my brother, who is a nurse actually on a psychiatric unit at our hospital, and he took me aside and he said, Jan, there is no prize for being a martyr. This is the life that you get. Now, you either can stay in this marriage and be miserable because you can't expect him to change, or you can take the situation into your own hands and make the best of the years that you have left. And that was really powerful, that phrase, there's no prize for being a martyr, because it flies in the face of what Christianity teaches, that martyrdom brings you the ultimate prize. It's so interesting what you said there about your brother's profession, because there's probably a lot to discuss and unpack. Maybe it would be a great discussion another time, but the career path that your brother has chosen around being a nurse on a psychiatric ward, I'm sure with a lot of high demand religious groups is not really in keeping with their belief systems in terms of social sciences and mental health and support around mental health and diagnoses and
a lot of the time when we talk about high demand religious groups, there's like exorcisms taking place with people that are suffering so horribly with their mental health. So it's kind of like an interesting aside there about your brother's chosen career path. But if we look back at at some of the things like the sunk cost fallacy and some of the things you talked about, people committing to their faith-based group, when you have that moment of snapping or waking up or whichever phrase people would like to apply to that experience, then you have those strong emotions as shown in shows like Tinder Swindler and Catfish. There's the grief, as you mentioned, there's the anger, as you mentioned, kind of just feel like you've been hustled out of all of this money, especially if you go on to do your own research about the Bible and realize that there are tens of thousands of different interpretations and people who believe these different interpretations and believe that they have the correct interpretation. And then you do research into things like cults and cult think and cult-like methods and realize that those were probably some of the tactics that you were being subjected to. So then there's anger, you feel humiliated if you're going to, these women that have had all of this money that they've given away to this person who they think is one thing, turns out to be another completely different thing. You wouldn't want to come forward with that because you might feel embarrassed and humiliated.
And that's the same with pastors, ex-missionaries, people who were very devoted, people who were busy making disciples of others. And then they have the realization that, oh my God, this isn't actually true. This whole thing was a book of mythology. I wasn't supposed to be taking it literally. But then in the meantime, you've won other people for Jesus. You brought other people into the fold. And it's so to publicly, own that and say, I am sorry, I made a huge mistake and other people are now paying for that mistake. And I'm sure that's part of the reason that I do the work that I do, because I look at my daughters and how they were impacted negatively by my own beliefs. And so I am devoting the rest of my life to try and help other people who are likewise coming out of difficult, demanding belief systems.
I suppose then on top of all of those emotions, there's a lot of guilt that comes with the potential trauma that you have enabled other people to experience in bringing them into the fold or converting them. And then a lot of time spent trying to convince them to do the opposite of what you've convinced them to do already.
It was actually my youngest daughter. She was only about 16 or 17, probably the last time that when I really wrote out my apology to my kids. And I wrote them separate letters because it had impacted both of them differently. And my youngest one, she wrote back and said, Mom, I have forgiven you. I don't blame you. And now we never have to talk about this again. Like it was her way of just letting me know, okay, lady, you've apologized enough. I get it. And I'm fortunate that both my daughters were so accepting of my apologies and that our relationship has continued to grow. And of course, they're both, I've offered them therapy, not through myself, but to, encourage them to be reaching out to get any help that they feel that they need.
And I feel it's so important to just mention here that the bond that you have with your children and the family that you have now and the love that you have in your life and the relationships that you're able to build on are those secular and worldly relationships that are so oppressed, just not something to even be comprehended by people in high demand religious groups. And it's always nice for me to be able to point out that some of that unconditional love that people feel in their lives comes from outside of high demand religious groups. And actually conditional love is what people experience inside the groups, because you only have access to that community and you only have access to that love as long as you're a member of the group. So of course that's not what you have just experienced there, having with your two children.
Yeah, and for sure, one of the most painful issues that clients bring to me is this massive gulf that now exists between them and their parents or their siblings, their family of origin, if they're the only ones that have rejected the faith. And they would like to still maintain some degree of connection, but it becomes so shallow when mom and dad or siblings can only talk about this is the end of the world, and you've stepped outside, you've stepped out from under the umbrella. Everything for them is a spiritual battle. And so then it makes it really hard to maintain any kind of ties with them. But it can be helpful. I mean, for people who are caught in either a conspiracy mindset or a fundamentalist mindset, if we can keep the door to communication open so that we are the one person, we may be the only person, may have burned every other bridge, but when they start having doubts, they remember that we were polite. We weren't calling them an idiot and calling them all these things. We've tried to keep that avenue of communication open. And I do realize some people are so unhealthy that for our own protection, we have to make a very firm boundary. Sometimes we do have to disengage completely from that person. But if we don't have to, then it could be beneficial for that one sometime down the road, as well as reminding them occasionally, remember when we had that great time when we went to that dance or we did that thing when we were kids, like things that were apart from that group, trying to remind them what were they like before they adopted this group, if they weren't born into it, adopted this mindset.
Absolutely, just being that person on the other side of that threshold, as you mentioned, and knowing that there is a non-judgmental safe space outside of that religious group could be the difference between life and death sometimes, I think. Especially with some of the guests that we've had on the show talking about their allies and how they were able to come back from those really difficult and dark thoughts around taking their own life and self-harm. And so we like to thank all of those people, just like your daughter who was like, Mum, it's done and it's okay. So those people are so incredibly important in our lives. And so you go to a place where you realize that you aren't the only person who's had these experiences, these thoughts, these feelings. That must have been such an incredible experience for you, like validating, and also like, oh my goodness, I'm not the only person who's experienced these things.
It was a huge relief. And I think everyone who comes across Dr. Winnell's book for the first time, like people have expressed that to me, that was the first time that they felt they weren't alone. And I've actually had people reach out to me from Twitter, people I'll probably never meet in real life, who have messaged me privately and said, you have no idea. Until I started reading your posts, I thought I was the only one. So it's important for us to reach out and let other people know, provided we feel strong enough and it feels like a safe space to us. But all of my work, all of my energy now really is devoted to helping people who have left fundamentalist groups. There's plenty of help available for people who are happy in those groups. They've got lots of support in their communities. I'm there. I picture myself, I'm not walking down the church aisle, yanking people out of their pews. I'm standing at the bottom of the stairs outside the church for when they're thrown out or they stumble out or they fall out, and I'm going to catch them and tell them, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. You're not alone. You're not the first person to leave this belief system, and you won't be the last. And I can help you. I can walk with you on your journey.
Wow. I bet it's so impactful for you to see people have those moments of, oh my goodness, everybody here has experienced the same thing, or the things you're telling me, they are what's familiar to me. That was my experience, because you've had those experiences yourself. So you're able to sort of, as you said, you're more of an emotional person. So I'm sure that your empathy level is just absolutely through the roof. So when people have these moments of validation, you're there to know how that feels. And that must just be such an incredible feeling for you as a professional.
Yes, it feels wonderful. And this is one reason support groups are very helpful. I would say for some folks, they're vital, as they've left that entire community and belief system behind. There are different support groups. Even on Facebook, I run a group called the Divorcing Religion Group, and it's for anybody who's left a fundamentalist religious belief system behind. So we have people from all different backgrounds and who are just trying to figure things out. And that, people are grateful to have a place where they can belong and they can ask questions and they're not going to be judged.
Wow. I will put a link to that Facebook group in the episode description, as well as a link to the information on the conference on religious trauma.
And the Purity Culture Conference.
Yes, which is in October, I think. I saw on one of your TikTok videos. So I will put a link to that as well. Before we get into kind of your TikTok channel, which I'm really excited to talk about, can you tell us what some of the causes of religious trauma syndrome might look like?
Some of the causes, like what causes religious trauma syndrome?
Yeah, I feel like that might be a very obvious question for people who have had those experiences or grown up in those environments. But for people who have maybe never heard of the term, or for people like myself who haven't had those experiences personally, do you know of what maybe some familiar experiences are from sort of case to case, and the people that you work with that seem to be intrinsic with religious trauma syndrome?
Sure. Interestingly, so I'm sure you've heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, and then there are, children who grew up in alcoholic homes, and there's a lot of crossover of symptoms and experiences for people who grew up in very religious homes and people who grew up in alcoholic homes. Religious trauma syndrome can result from being raised in a shame-based, emotionally dishonest, emotionally abusive environment where we were threatened with both eternal damnation and parental alienation for our disbelief.
What are some of the different ways a person might experience spiritual abuse? Is it generally a case-to-case basis, or dependent on the church group or the branch of religion that you are under? Because of course there are, as we said before, thousands even just within the umbrella of Christianity that exist.
Trauma, of course, is subjective. So two people can witness the same thing. One can walk away having been deeply traumatized, and the other just not so much. So there are different things at play, including certainly the support system that is available to us at the time. And religious trauma syndrome is very much in line with complex PTSD. So it's not from a one-time event particularly. It's over and over and over again, reinforced very consistently throughout your life. My mom says, well, my religion has never been traumatizing for me. And I'm like, well, really? Because it sure the hell was traumatizing for me and my siblings. And part of what's going on there is her need. It's the sunk cost fallacy at work. She's devoted her entire life to it. And also she has a very strong need, even though they're divorced, to continue protecting my father, who was the abuser. So my relationship with her, I'm fortunate in that we still do have a good and fairly close relationship. We're aware that religion is a difficult topic for us. So we just typically don't talk about religion. She's in her 80s. I don't want her having an existential crisis this late in her life. I want her just to slide into home plate feeling like Jesus loves her and everything's great. Like But yeah, it's a very different perspective. She thinks that religion is not traumatizing at all, at least not hers. Everyone else's religion is highly suspect, of course. A cult is everyone else's religion.
Absolutely, yeah. In definitely in one sense of the word. I feel like the word cult means something different to each person you speak to. Maybe that's the beauty of it, but maybe that's the reason why people never think that they are a part of a cult, because the definition of cult is not really something easy to define. But
the people who have a problem with me doing work around religious trauma, like religious trauma conferences, are people who are still religious. So people who call themselves counselors, or maybe they went through a Christian university, and so they're allowed to use the title of therapist. And I'm saying, no, if someone has religious trauma, they ought never be going to a religious therapist. They need a secular therapist.
I didn't even realize that was a thing. That makes me feel so uncomfortable.
In the United States, absolutely it is. And so, but those folks are still stuck in that religious paradigm. They're really entrenched in it, and they take a lot of issue with me talking about it and indicating that their religion can cause any harm.
I feel like that is where there is so much potential for further harm if somebody is experiencing ill mental health and they go to see a therapist or counsellor specific to religion, because I'm not sure if every person in that situation would recognise or understand that a person is suffering with ill mental health, and actually it could be exacerbated through those things, especially if somebody's experiencing like severe depression. And we've heard on the show that people have been blamed for not being holy enough or not going back to the Bible enough. And actually then there is a blame placed on the individual who's experiencing those things. And that kind of makes me really feel so worried about the people in those situations.
And in extreme conditions, and apart from Catholicism, I know some of the Pentecostal stuff really gets out of whack, and they will try and cast out demons. And children are deprived of medication, diabetics not given insulin because the parents are so deluded, and the church elders or whatever so deluded that they insist that a miracle is going to take place. But the problem is, as soon as we are willing to suspend our disbelief in the universe and we are opening up to supernatural things, we immediately become vulnerable to charlatans of every stripe, whether they are saying, I can talk to the dead, give me your money, or whether they're saying, God told me you have to marry me. So that's why we need instead to be demanding evidence all the time for people making outrageous claims.
It's funny that you call that an outrageous claim, because I just released an episode last week with somebody called Daniel, where he talked to me about his experiences in KwaZulu-Natal, a South African originated Christian religious sect, where the practice around marriage ceremonies is where the man has a vision in his sleep, where he is told that he is to marry a certain person in the church group, and so he will go up to the young woman and say, I had a vision where I was told that we were supposed to be married, and then the woman has to go away and consider whether she's going to say yes or no. But Daniel said that there is implied, or it's suggested that she should of course agree to that marriage ceremony. She can say no if she wants to, but so that
but she'd be saying no to God. So
it's interesting. But then Daniel said what's even stranger is that one woman that he knows personally, who I will get the chance to speak to on the show soon, she had 3 separate marriage ceremonies. So what's God's plan in that scenario? I thought was quite interesting.
Very interesting. Yes, I believe Aunt Glo actually had a marriage proposal.
Oh my goodness, Aunt Glo. I'm so excited to speak about Aunt Glo. So this kind of segues us nicely into my next question, which was going to be around whether you think that leaders may do this damage or inflict religious trauma or spiritually abuse people without realizing what they're doing. Of course, we've spoken about how conservative you were with yourself and your children growing up, and how you are regretful of that now. Of course, you didn't think you were inflicting damage on yourself or anybody else in doing those things. So there is that to consider. There's the pastors who have now divorced religion, and so there's that we've talked about, which we should also consider. But of course, the difficult thing about this question is the systematic, I don't know if indoctrination is the right word, but that kind of thing that these people may have experienced from childhood, from birth, up until where they are preaching this scripture and using this rhetoric. So I'm sure that the answer is yes, they do it without realizing, but I'm just really keen on your perspective.
Having been married to a pastor who also was just a very good human and who really cared about other people, I confidently can say that not all pastors, ministers, religious leaders are narcissists, and they don't all have this nefarious intent of I'm going to be controlling, my minions. Some are like that for sure, because narcissists are really drawn to fundamentalist groups, and of course any patriarchal belief system where they can abuse people and get away with it. So there are some, but then there are many who, like you say, were raised in it and who absolutely believe that the world would be a completely better place if everybody would just adopt, Jesus, believe in the Lord Jesus. And this is where the United States is getting perilously close to theocracy as the evangelicals just gain so much steam.
I have here evangelical extremism in the USA. What are your thoughts? So that was going to be a question that I ask you in a little while, especially considering where you are in the world and not being located in America.
I'm reading your mind.
Yeah, it feels that way. Absolutely. I'm starting to feel like maybe there could be some strange mystical things going on, even if I am a skeptic. But you kind of alluded there, or even mentioned that there are times where there will be narcissists in leadership. There will be people attracted to those positions of power where they feel like they can exert that power and really exploit people underneath them. I suppose as well that there is the cases of historical abuse that are covered up by high demand religious groups. Where abusers can carry out years and years and years of physical, sexual, emotional, financial, spiritual abuse against people. And because of the risk of exposing, the risk of being exposed, or the risk of like a media collapse, or court trials, or law enforcement getting involved, a lot of the time these abuse cases are covered up. Of course, there's even situations like the one that your mother was involved in, where the abuse was never reported, perhaps because the person has justified the actions, or because they really don't feel like the perpetrator's at fault at all. And I'm sure that that's a discussion that you're trained to have with people that have been in those experiences. Perhaps it is also the case that, just taking Jehovah's Witnesses as an example, with their historical abuse cases, which are now coming to light, where law enforcement haven't been notified of cases of sex abuse, sexual abuse against minors, and physical abuse, because the elders claim to have carried out in their own internal investigations and have conceded that the fate of the individual or the perpetrator is now in the hands of Jehovah, and they will answer to Jehovah when the time comes. Of course, as somebody that's not religious, I don't think that's adequate whatsoever. And it is illegal, which is why it goes unreported for so long.
Right. And predators always seek positions of authority. They always do. And what better place than a church where forgiveness can be weaponized by abusers, and children and women and victims of this abuse are silenced.
Not only silenced, but of course blamed a lot of the time as well for the acts that are carried out against them, for bringing on those actions to themselves, either through their impure thoughts or their clothing, and all manner of inconceivable excuses.
And that's also where we see that it crosses the lines. It doesn't even have to be religion. So in groups where they talk so much about you're going to manifest this and manifest that, and it's the secret and the law of attraction, well, that's super duper if great things are coming your way. But if you happen to get cancer or something terrible happens, well, you've manifested that. You've brought that on yourself. So there we see victim blaming and shaming again. And it's a horrible thing.
What are some common issues, would you say, that are linked with religious trauma syndrome that you see sort of on a day-to-day basis in your work?
Very high on the list is fear of hell. People virtually paralyzed by this fear of hell, which was instilled in them when they were children by adults that were responsible for their lives. So if mom and dad say it, it must be true. So we're taking it in. It's terrifying. So it's got that added element. And all these psychological booby traps kind of go around that knowledge that they've given us, that if I sin, if I don't invite Jesus in my heart, if I displease God, I'm going to roast forever and be eternally tortured and separated from mommy and daddy. So there's so many booby traps around that even when we've been able to leave the religion and, cognitively, we know that no, there is no hell. We don't have to worry about that. That fear is so tenacious. It's like chewing gum in our brain, just trying to get it out. And of course, that takes time, and it also takes effort at trying to educate ourselves about, well, when did even the word hell start popping up in literature, and how have other people coped with this fear of hell? So a lot of education, self-education, psychoeducation. Fear of hell, and then relationships would be the next really big deal. So either their parents have cut them off, or that relationship is becoming shallower and shallower, or they likely married when they were very religious and married a believing spouse. And now maybe they have kids even. And so one partner doesn't believe anymore, and they either don't feel they can safely tell the other partner, or they do tell the other partner, or the other partner guesses what's going on, and then they go into overdrive and they're telling the children, mommy's going to hell, or daddy's going to hell, or we have to pray more. And it puts children in a terrible, terrible situation, being in the middle of parents, that should never be the plight of children. And the relationship, the only important thing about the relationship then to the still religious spouse is the religion. So they're not focusing or willing to focus on what else do we have in common? How can we keep building and strengthening and fortifying our relationship apart from this one set of beliefs that we don't share? And that's that's a very sad, that's a sad place to be in.
If somebody was to decide that they would like to pursue a career in the same field that you are in, what advice would you have for them on sort of where to start? Where would be the best places to go? You've mentioned leaving the fold as kind of the first port of call in terms of educating yourself on religious trauma. But would you have any sort of guidance or steps that people might want to take if they were to think about becoming a counsellor around religious trauma themselves?
Just something practical they might want to do is start volunteering at their local crisis line or suicide hotline. And then you can get a feeling for what it's like to be in the hot seat when people in crisis want to talk to you. And I know a number of people who have attained their Bachelor of Arts in psychology, but they don't like counseling. They don't want anything to do with counseling. They've found out they don't want anything to do with people who are in crisis. So then they maybe prefer to go into the research end of things. So you can probably tell within yourself do you love listening to people's stories? I do. Are you a deeply compassionate person with a lot of empathy? So you can probably tell whether you're drawn in one direction or another, but the practical idea of, try doing a crisis line or suicide hotline and see how that feels for you. And then different countries and different states or provinces or locations within that country will have different rules who can practice what. So you need to become aware of licensure laws. And then some people prefer to go the social work route. Some people they want to become a psychologist. I'm a registered professional counselor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. And of course, I bring my own experience to it, and then all the research that I've done as well. And so I work with clients one-on-one, and then I also run my group workshop online, which I really enjoy because group work can be quite gratifying. And then the other thing I'm doing is taking my career right now in a slightly different direction with hosting these conferences related to religious trauma and recovery from purity culture. So being flexible is going to be a big help for people.
And would you say that these conferences that you are running are accessible for people that maybe haven't had these experiences and want to understand the subject a bit more and maybe equip themselves with some more knowledge?
Yes. So I have lots of therapists and social workers attend, and lots of them come from religious trauma backgrounds, and then some of them don't, and they recognize they need to get some teaching on it. And then lots of people who have come out of traumatically religious backgrounds. And then also different people, primarily from the atheist communities, who maybe they didn't grow up with religion at all, but they're realizing how impactful religious trauma is. And so they want to learn more about it themselves. So I try and make the conferences interesting and accessible to everyone. Like if you're not a therapist, you can still sit in on a session and find it interesting.
That sounds amazing. It sounds great. And if I do manage to get this episode edited and out on time, you have actually provided a code for listeners to get a discounted ticket on the conference on religious trauma, which is taking place towards the end of April. And that code is podcast 20, I believe.
Yes, with a capital P, and of course 20 is a numeral 20, and it's all one word, podcast 20. And then they get $20 US taken off their ticket price.
So that sounds like a great resource, accessible for all manner of people, including people such as myself, who I would consider grew up atheist without much religion in my life. So this every conversation is a learning journey for me. I'm actually trying to read the Bible at the moment to educate myself and understand it a bit better, because people that have grown up in these high demand religious groups that can just spew the scripture to me. It just washes over me sometimes. So I'm really trying to get a grasp on that text. So I'm reading the King James Bible at the moment.
Oh God, you're reading the King James.
Yeah, it just seems to be it's really difficult, but it seems to be the one that is referenced quite often on the show. So it's
the fundy Bible of choice.
We're getting through it slowly. And hopefully maybe by this time next year I'll be more versed in
nice one.
I just said kind of in air quotes that people can't see in that religious text, which I think is important if I don't have that experience and I'm speaking to people that have lived their entire lives based on this text. So so there is that. So this conference, a conference on religious trauma that is going to be led by you, Janice, as the host, and Podcast 20 can get $20 off of your admission ticket. And it's accessible for all manner of people from all different backgrounds, and everybody that attends will learn a lot. So that's really great. And I just have a few more questions to ask before we finish today, because I know that you have another meeting straight after this get together that we're having.
Can I just also mention that if people want to attend both the conference on religious trauma and the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference, they can buy their tickets at the same time and get a $50 discount.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. That's great. That's huge.
And that'll be in October online.
So I'll make sure that we post all of that on social media. Sure. Just make a little note there, and we'll put the links in the episode description. And of course, if we don't manage to get the episode out before the end of April, then I will still post the links to the Purity Culture Conference that's taking place in October.
And recordings will be available. People can buy the recordings anytime after the conference has taken place.
That's
so
fantastic.
People can access them at any time. Yeah,
that's so great. That's such a fantastic resource to just put out there in the world for people to access. What advice do you have? And I'm sure this is probably like a 10-hour answer, but what kind of summarized advice would you give to people who may be suffering with religious trauma syndrome?
So educate yourself about trauma, and also about how our bodies store trauma, and how we can continue to be impacted by traumatic events even after the fact. So there's a really popular book, The Body Keeps the Score, by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And then there are lots of other books and videos related to recovering from trauma. And of course, you'll want to educate yourself on religious trauma specifically. So I've already mentioned Dr. Winnell's book, Leaving the Fold. It's important, I feel like, especially for those of us who grew up being indoctrinated by purity culture. So we were told that sex is bad, our body is bad, masturbation is bad. A lot of us can actually have come disconnected from our bodies. And so the idea of looking at sex and sexuality and purity culture, I would direct people to a therapist named Erica M. Smith, and she has a program called Purity Culture Dropout. And Erica is one of our speakers at the Shameless Sexuality Conference in October. So start addressing the ways that you have been impacted by your own religious trauma. Make sure you're moving around. Make sure you're getting some degree of physical activity and exercise. That can really help when we've been traumatized. And then also, don't forget the importance of creativity explore your creativity. You might be dancing, you might be painting, you might decide you're going to journal or write a play. Being in touch with your creative side is also very healing.
I feel like that is my biggest, I don't know, I'm a cheerleader for creativity when it comes to speaking about those things on the podcast, especially when people manage to return to things that they enjoyed that at one time or another were triggering for them because of the association that they had with that creativity in terms of their high demand religious group or high control group.
Yeah, so they can reclaim it. It's important to reclaim that creativity. Very true.
Oh, that's just, I'm just such an advocate for that when it comes to talking about creativity on the show. And what you said there about self-care is so extremely important for every individual. And I imagine even more intrinsic to the recovery of somebody that has experienced any manner of trauma, and just getting that exercise, having a long bath, getting a good night's sleep, having a balanced meal, all of those things that people will often tell you to do if you're really struggling to take care of yourself. So
I feel like one important thing I left out, which does kind of fall under the whole category of being in touch with your body physically and understanding trauma, the whole idea of being trauma informed, or a therapist or someone working with you, a clinician who's trauma informed. So they're recognizing the ways that trauma can hijack your body physically. So even without the help of a therapist, you can look up some grounding exercises, ways to ground yourself, ways to draw yourself back into the present moment in your body, because a lot of us who have been traumatized will tend to disassociate. We're kind of floating away. So learning over and over, practicing how to be present in our bodies and recognize that we're safe. We're safe now. The trauma happened in the past. We're safe now. I didn't want to miss out on that part.
A lot of what you have sort of highlighted there on advice for people to potentially follow if they have or are experiencing religious trauma is very similar to what you went through. You mentioned that people may want to read about or become informed about trauma as a broader subject, as you did, kind of reading about cults, and then narrow it down to specifically religious trauma, and to learn what that looks like as more of a focused subject matter. And I feel like that's what you did too when you found your book Leaving the Fold, and kind of went into that journey as well. And it clearly had a positive and beneficial effect on you following that route to recovery. I know that recovery for a lot of survivors never ends, and I'm sure every day for you is still a learning journey, and you're still finding new things to deal with and new ways to heal.
Yeah, people still get triggered even decades down the road. And typically when we're triggered, we're bumping up against something from our past that hasn't quite been adequately examined or explored or grieved, mourned. And those who grow up in fundamentalist religious homes, codependency can be a really big deal. So that's another thing I would encourage anyone who is on their journey of recovery, do some exploration around what codependency is, and earnestly looking at your own life and seeing relationship patterns that may show you, oh yeah, that was a very codependent relationship. We have to be able to, acknowledge our losses in order to properly mourn them, in order to be able to release some of that grief and heal from it. And we're walking through life with our eyes open a little more widely, so that we're not just taking everyone at their word, and that's how we get tricked into, participating in frauds or, falling into other cults.
How many people would you say you work with at any one point?
Right now, this has been quite a lean month as far as there haven't been a lot of people reaching out. And I find that in the lead up to Christmas, the American Thanksgiving and Christmas, oh my God, people are so desperate because they know they're going to be spending all this time with families. And then after Christmas, they're so broke, they don't have time, or they don't have the money for therapy. And then just kind of whatever else is going along. So right now, I have a lot of space, except that I'm also working on putting these two conferences together, and that obviously takes up a fair amount of time and energy on my part. But people can always reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook, or they can send me an email, and if I have the time, I'm happy to write back.
Do you feel like people reach out more so around religious holidays? I know that sometimes we speak about the more messianic Christian groups that may not recognize or celebrate specific religious holidays or pagan holidays, like Christmas, maybe Easter. Do you feel like with your work, you do get more people reaching out around those times of maybe high contact?
Yeah, I think that that probably makes sense. Mm-hmm. Of course, when you suffer from trauma, you're all year round, you're kind of mired in the grief and the sadness and the confusion. Any time is a good time to reach out. If you're struggling, don't wait until things get worse. Reach out now.
And do you find yourself working with a lot of people that may identify with the LGBTQIA plus or the Black, Indigenous and people of colour communities that may feel even more marginalised by the high demand religious group than perhaps other communities may feel?
LGBTQ Two-Spirit IA plus. Yes, I do hear from a lot of folks, and I would also include myself in that community as well. So I think maybe they feel or they realize they can reach out to me, and they're only going to be received with compassion and empathy, no judgment. The BIPOC community is, I just really feel that there's such a struggle there, because particularly if you're looking at Black America, Christianity is really woven into their whole, the church is the community, the backbone. And so for people of color in the United States to step away from that and say, that's not what I believe anymore, they face a huge difficulty to overcome their losses, of course, can be quite huge. And so I often point folks towards Black Non-Believers, which is a great organization in the United States set up by Mandisa Thomas, who speaks at our Conference on Religious Trauma. And I do, of course, work with people of color. Anyone's welcome to reach out to me. I have a real passion for First Nations Canadians. That's our Indigenous First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Canadians who were victimized terribly by the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, in the form of residential schooling. And they were torn away from their families at the behest of our government, in the last 100 years, and forced into religious schools. They suffered terribly. And even though the residential schools are now closed, Indigenous Canadians are still suffering. And so I do work and do some reaching out to Indigenous communities with some First Nations colleagues. That's a real passion.
So your work is entirely accessible by really any individual from any walk of life. And I think that's absolutely incredible.
I sure hope so. I want it to be.
So 2 more things before we finish today. I did want to go back quickly to that question around evangelical extremism in the US, and wondered if you could just kind of offer your thoughts on the condition of that situation at the moment, what it looks like from your perspective as a professional, from your perspective as somebody who has divorced religion, and your perspective as somebody that's sitting over in Canada as well, a bit closer to America, but still not really in the heart of things, because I'm sure the way that I am seeing it over here is very different to how it actually is over there. But from my position, it's terrifying.
Yeah, it's the same. I consider it absolutely dire. It is terrifying. I want everybody to educate themselves on Christian nationalism, the rise of Christian nationalism. This will be also a focus at the Conference on Religious Trauma, talking about the toxic mix of religion and politics. And it's been in the works for decades, really back in the 1970s, evangelicalism, when it started taking root, and they started determining that everybody needs Jesus. It's not just me personally, everybody needs Jesus. And so then they really set about getting themselves installed in positions of leadership at the local level, the city, municipal, school board, and mayor, and then maybe your premier, your prime minister, going up through all parts of governance. And then, of course, in they have 7 spheres or 7 mountains that they consider that they need to really become dominant influence. So that's what we see now. That's what's happening now. And the entire Republican Party, by and large, seems to have been taken over by this evangelical mindset. And then, of course, you weave QAnon in with that. And QAnon is a fascinating and terrifying thing. We've basically watched a religion arise in the last couple of years. It's very concerning. It's very concerning. And as a Canadian, I do feel concerned, where sometimes we're a little bit too close for comfort to America. I feel just fine with their current president, but oh boy, anyone else that gets in there who is espousing religion and insisting on taking rights away from women and minorities, that's not good.
It's really quite terrifying what is happening with QAnon, and it's as you said, it's kind of strange to watch it happening and unfold in our lifetime, because I feel like it's something you read about in history books but don't actually see happening. I remember posting something on social media about a citizen in Canada who was claiming to be the secret queen of Canada. And she was a part of QAnon and instructing her followers to open arms on people who weren't believers of QAnon, of Trump, and the whole kind of MAGA movement community around the kind of Make America Great Again Trump slogan. And her name was Romana Didulo. I think that she may have actually been arrested, maybe, or there were definitely some things that happened around that situation for her to no longer be in the headlines or in the media anymore.
And it also crosses over into the anti-vax community now, the conspiracy, and it all has to do with binary thinking, black and white thinking, supernatural, being open to those things. It's really not accepting fact as fact, is turning everything on its head. So we believe they're in danger. They believe we're in danger. It's a real topsy-turvy and quite scary situation.
It feels like it can almost be linked to into extremist evangelicalism in the way that scripture is used to spiritually abuse people, to justify or explain away anything that may cause somebody to ask rational questions or ask something that may encourage free thinking. And then the spiritual text is used to explain those things away. And of course, if extremist or if very fundamentalist evangelicals have grown up with that systematic explaining away of any doubts or questions, then it may be even easier for them to go down these online rabbit holes and be convinced of all of these other things that people on the outside may look at and say that that's totally wild, and I really don't know how you got to that place. And again, it's a question of really needing to understand the kind of the methodologies and everything else that goes with it. It's not just people don't just wake up one day and believe in the total bridge to freedom and thetans and all of that with Scientology, you know. So people don't just jump off the deep end.
That's right. And evolution has really wired our brains to seek shortcuts. We want shortcuts. And so cults and conspiracy groups and even religions, they come along and promise this simple answer to very complex problems. And okay, I would rather swallow that than have to spend hours and weeks and years of my life actually parsing out all the different elements of this complex problem. Instead, if you just tell me all I have to do is believe in Jesus, or the government is bad, okay, I'm just going to believe that then. But there's such a fine line between fundamentalism, which is about beliefs, and fanaticism, which is always about action. It doesn't take much for fundamentalism to move over into fanaticism. And we do need to be aware of what's going on right now around us.
Yeah, and it seems like that kind of that threshold from fundamentalism over into fanaticism is definitely happening, and the potential for offline harm is terrifying. I'm just halfway through The Cult of Trump, which is heavy reading, but very insightful in terms of how all of this has been able to happen. So I do recommend that for anybody who is really trying to understand where it started.
Is that Steve Hassan's book?
It is, yeah.
Bite model, very important.
Incredibly important. So he kind of just goes through and talks about how Trump was able to basically do what he did through all of the methodologies and explained. And he does go through that bite model in The Cult of Trump as well, kind of applying all of those points to that model. So the last thing that I had that I quickly wanted to go over, because I know you need to jump ship into another call in just a few minutes, is to just let people know about your TikTok and all the other places that they can find you. So let's start with your TikTok channel, which I have just spent the day watching your videos. It's been absolutely delightful.
Good.
I've really enjoyed it. It's as you said, it's been insightful, but it's been like tongue in cheek, and it's been a little bit laid back, and there's humor, so it really does make a heavy topic feel a bit lighter to digest. Yes. So please talk us through your TikTok.
Sure. People can find me as Janice Selbie on TikTok. That's just my name. And I do have a character, persona that I've adopted when I'm on there, and her name is Gloria, and she's from New York in the United States. And she came out of a Pentecostal background. And so I use Gloria often when I'm remembering some of the aspects of my own religious training or my time in church. So I do try and make it humorous when I can, because religious trauma is a really heavy topic. And there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of TikTokers who are engaging very seriously on the platform about religious trauma. I do find it serious. I'm passionate about it. But I also think people need to be able to laugh. When we can laugh sometimes at some of the things that have taken place in our life, it can show that a measure of healing has taken place. So people can certainly look me up on TikTok and spend some time with Gloria, or Auntie Glow, call her Auntie Glow for short. And it's really good for me. It's helpful for me because it's lighthearted and gives me an opportunity just to laugh at myself a little bit. So that's on TikTok. And then people can find me on Twitter at Divorce Religion, one word, or at Wise Counsellor. And there's an underscore in between those two words. And Counsellor, I spell the British way, of course, with two L's. I'm also on there as Come to Court, which is come to, and then CORT, Come to Court. And Shameless Sexuality is on there as well. So lots of ways to reach me on Twitter. You can reach out to me on Facebook, just plain old Janice Selbie. And my group is the Divorcing Religion group. People can send me an email too, janice.selbie@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from folks who have any questions. Oh, and my website. Wait a sec, I can't forget that. divorcing-religion.com.
I will add all of the links to all of these things that you have just reeled off for us into the episode description. I made some notes here on Aunt Glow. I just thought it was so funny because you're so approachable and softly spoken, and Aunt Glow is just abrasive and she's loud. And I was like, oh my goodness, Janice is really stepping into role with this. But I feel like she's relatable as kind of like that stereotypical, religious family member that people will easily recognize, maybe even if they haven't had too much association with religion in their lives. But your TikTok channel also goes through, it also names some terms for things that people may be experiencing but aren't able to kind of understand because they don't know what the term is or what the definition is. So you definitely go through that, and you put your lived experiences in there, and you list different resources as well. So it's kind of like a nice compilation of different things, as well as kind of having Aunt Glow in there to cheer everybody's days up. So I'll put the link to the TikTok channel in there as well, with the fantastic white glasses that you wear, which I just love as well.
Everyone loves those glasses.
It's so fantastic. It's so funny because every time I see kind of like the little thumbnail for the video and you have the glasses on, I'm like, it's another Aunt Glow video. So I just love that. Fantastic. So I'll make sure that I add the links that you've mentioned. I'll also try to highlight wherever I can the podcast 20 code for the conference on religious trauma coming up at the end of April. There's another conference coming up in October around purity culture. You've listed some incredible speakers and organizers and people that work within the field that can help with specific different parts of overcoming religious trauma, which I think has been incredibly helpful. You've mentioned different books and given people a real starters or beginner's guide into understanding religious trauma, how to study it, how to understand their own experiences, and also how to support others who may be experiencing religious trauma as well, because of course it's not just the individual who's breaking free or divorcing religion, it's also for people such as myself to understand how we can support people coming out of those experiences. So you've kind of given us everything, as well as a little bit of insight into your own experiences. So I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you, Janice, and everything that you're doing to help people. And I think your work is invaluable, and it's amazing how you just have it available for people to access after the fact as well. So just thank you so much for your time today.
Well, what a pleasure it's been. I've really had a good time. I'm so sorry I have to cut it short, but I'll be in touch with you again.
Thanks, Janice. And Aunt Gloria, I'll speak to you soon as well.
Okay, sweetheart. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye now.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been The Cult Vault.